effects of federal tax policy on charitable giving. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by two researchers who've come out with a very intriguing study about what they have found to be the effects of the changes in federal tax policy that were signed into law at the end of 2017, taking effect in 2018, and what that subsequently has meant for charitable giving. I'm joined by Howard Husock of the American Enterprise Institute and E.J. McMahon of the Empire State Institute on Public Policy. And Howard and E.J., thank you so much for being with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
So, Howard, first of all, before we get into the findings, what is your interest here about federal tax policy and charitable giving? Why explore this topic at all?
Well, we were interested because charitable giving is the lifeblood of so many organizations. It's not a minor aspect of tax law. You can view it through the tax law prism, but as anybody who is in the development world or the nonprofit management world knows, charitable giving is the lifeblood of so many community organizations. In other words, this is something that's very important to me personally. I wrote a 2019 book about civil society, and anybody who cares about American civil society, going back to the Tocquevillian sense of it all, knows that charitable giving keeps good ideas alive and helps new ideas flourish.
In fact, Tocqueville saying that Americans form in these voluntary associations, and it's a bedrock of what we teach in our academic programs related to the uniqueness of the philanthropic sector. So, EJ, you dived into this with Howard. There was that big federal change in tax policy, starting with new rules for 2018. What did you and Howard find related to charitable giving?
Well, what we found, just to sum up in the broadest sense, is that charitable giving as a percentage of adjusted gross income declined. Now, this was to be expected to some degree because one of the law's most important changes significantly reduced the tax incentive for charitable giving. Charitable giving was deductible as an itemized deduction. So prior to the passage of the tax law, a large proportion of taxpayers were itemizing, especially the middle and upper middle class and beyond. After the tax law changed, itemizing went way down, and there's a simple reason for that. The tax law doubled what's known as the standard deduction. At the standard deduction, what had been in the neighborhood of $12,000 for a married couple and about half that for an individual, it was basically doubled. It was raised to just about doubled to $25,000 in 1 year. It's now, because it's indexed to inflation, it's approaching $30,000. What that meant was that the single biggest chore associated with tax preparation for your basically for a typical middle class household was eliminated, because you no longer had to collect a lot of receipts for deductible items. For most people in income ranges from, say, $50,000 up to $150,000, the standard deduction was now bigger than your itemized deductions had totaled. And so you didn't need to itemize anymore. What that also meant, however, was that you no longer had an incentive to add on to and pile up a lot of itemized deductions as a way to reduce your tax bill, because you were basically being given a much bigger deduction right off the bat. And that was a major cause of this change in itemized charitable giving. That is, charitable contributions by individuals that were claimed as deductions on tax forms.
And so the standard deduction was doubled. There's less of an incentive to donate to charity as a way to save on your taxes. And about a third of the people were itemizing before the change. And this study looks at fewer than 10% now are itemizing their charitable giving. And so, again, under the tax policy approved in 2017, the standard deduction doubled. And before that, about 1/3 of Americans were itemizing their charitable giving to go above that standard deduction where it was in 2017 and earlier. And this paper finds that now fewer than 10% of people are itemizing. Howard, I want to ask you to help fundraisers see this in the broader context. When they're working with donors, as you well know, they're talking with donors about their philanthropic values, their philanthropic motivations, and yet tax considerations also are out there. How do taxes weigh into donor decisions with their charitable giving, which makes this finding so important for us to pay attention to?
Well, there have been innumerable studies that have shown that changes in tax law affect charitable giving. Changes in tax rates affect charitable giving because, in effect, you get a discount on your charitable giving. If you're in the 30 or 39% tax rate bracket, you get a discount by giving to charity when you do itemize. So charitable giving is influenced by the tax law. At the same time, let's think about the smaller donors here. Those of your development office who are working with larger donors and talking about their philanthropic values, some of those individuals may have family foundations, they may have large donor advised funds. They're in a different category than the smaller donor. Think of the smaller donor to whom they used to send end of year appeals, like the ones I get from the Salvation Army, the Appalachian Mountain Club, the trustees of reservations, Doctors Without Borders. I've given them all money, by the way. But those end of year entreaties, in effect, were predicated on the idea that people were going to itemize their taxes and needed to get a charitable deduction. That's out the window now. So you may want to talk to people about why Doctors Without Borders or Ball State University is a great cause, but there's no end of year pressure to do that anymore. And that changes the game.
And in fact, that's also amplified by what we know that about 40% of charitable giving from individuals occurs in November and December. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. The religious holidays, people feeling in a giving mood. Maybe it's okay, the year's coming to an end. I have discretionary income. And so I'm going to make some of that choice go to charitable giving. But also, some people have been thinking about their taxes and needing to make that gift before December 31st. EJ, can you continue that point? It would seem to me if somebody is, especially upper income, maybe upper middle income, that change in the standard deduction maybe didn't affect them at all. They're going to beat it no matter what, even with the increase. So therefore, it seems like we're really talking about a certain category of taxpayer here, a certain category of donor here, where perhaps this had the greatest effect.
Yes, I think I would focus in particular on people in the low hundreds. The biggest bracket above 5 digits that's reported in the IRS data is people who have adjusted gross incomes of $100,000 to $200,000 a year. That is upper middle income by national standards. It's actually dead middle, dead median in the suburbs of very expensive East Coast cities and it's part of the West Coast also. So, for instance, on Long Island, a couple who make $150,000 a year are basically qualify as typical. In the center of Indiana, they're pretty affluent. But this also, I think, it's fair to say, is a sweet spot for fundraising for many charities in terms of they're not the wealthiest people, but they're the largest number of people who have a certain amount of disposable income and who have proven to be inclined to give when asked. So here, let's think about how the incentives stacked up through 2017. The tax table basically said that if you're a married couple and your taxable income after other deductions, after other changes on what's called the above the line on the front of your tax return, you basically were paying a tax rate of 25% up to taxable income of 153, 75 to 153, or 28% from 153 up to the mid 200s. So you got a 3% range there. That meant that to the extent that you could hold your taxable income down below the next bracket you were in, because everything is marginal with the way the federal income tax is constructed, that it was actually paid 3% of your income when you're making $150,000 or so gross. That's several $1,000s. So basically what the tax code said was you can get a 25% discount on every dollar you give to charity during a year, in effect, because you're going to get that big a tax break. And it's going to hold you below going into the next bracket as well. It's going to mean that all of your income above a certain amount is subject to a lower tax rate. You had an incentive as the solicitations or as the fundraising appeals piled up at the end of the year, to make sure you sat down and set aside some time to catch up and give the max that was practical for you in order to reduce your tax bill. Now, people in this tax bracket, now you mentioned that, well, maybe most of them weren't affected by the standard deduction. Actually, most of them were affected by the standard deduction. Prior to 2018, 76% of the households filing tax returns with gross income of between 100 and 200,000, 76% were itemizing. Afterwards, in the most recent year we have, which is 2021, only 19% are itemizing. That's a really big decline. It was 15 million tax-paying households were itemizing in 2017. Only 4.5 million were itemizing in 2021. And one of their biggest deductions, one of their three largest deductions prior to the passage of the tax law was charitable giving. They were, on average, giving 14% of their total itemized deduction, was for charitable deductions. And the average deduction was about $4,400 from people making between $100,000 and $200,000. In 2021, the good news is the average deduction is nearly doubled. It's $8,500 from people in that bracket. The bad news is there's many, many fewer people itemizing in that bracket, and that the average the share of adjusted gross income that people in the low six figures are giving to charity has declined tremendously. It's gone down from over 2% to 1%, or basically it's gone down from 2.1% to about 1.1%. That's a really big difference of adjusted gross income.
And EJ, just to be more precise, what I was referring to, somebody who's a millionaire, that deduction wasn't going to change. I think you're right. This point that you're making, though, is this sweet spot for fundraisers. You said somebody with that AGI of 100, 150, 200. Both people in the household are working. Back in the day, that used to be rich. As you said, a lot of communities, that's now called middle class. And it could be blue-collar professions, a teacher and a public safety officer combining for that, and so on, that those are the folks most affected by this change. And Howard, one thing I want to ask you to do for our audience is help us make sense of this. Because on one hand, if we compare charitable giving in current dollars, the amount compared from 2017 to 2023 is up 36%. Inflation over that time is 24%. So charitable giving increasing about half time faster, 50% time faster than inflation. But if I'm understanding you and EJ correctly, Howard, you're not saying charitable giving necessarily went down. It's that the incentives have changed in a negative way, especially for this group of people. Am I understanding that correctly? Can you help us make sense of that, please?
Yes, I'm very concerned about the incentives. And let me make 2 points. One is our key statistical finding, is to look at adjusted gross income for those who are itemizing the charitable giving in all groups, not just the upper groups for whom it increased above $1 million. If it had stayed constant, we found that it would have been $80 billion more in charitable giving. So there's, as the economists say, an opportunity cost. There was money that might have been given had the percentage of adjusted gross income remained steady, and it didn't. Here's why I'm really worried about the broader implications of this. And I use the term, this is a luxury good, which the economists object to because they have a certain terminology for it. But here's what I mean by that. I'm concerned that the tax deduction for charity is going to be viewed as a tax loophole for the rich, because it's basically only people above $500,000 roughly who are really availing themselves of it in a big way. And I'm concerned about protecting the charitable deduction and having it not be in the crosshairs of a tax loophole for the rich. And I think the current trend is putting it in that spot.
When we look forward to possible revisions you might be recommending, I want to get to that in a moment. But EJ, I want to come back to you. One of the things fundraisers tell us when they come to our classes at the fundraising school is that maybe some donors are bunching. I'm sure you're familiar with this term, right? Because of this higher standard deduction, I'm actually going to take my charitable giving and putting in a savings account. And I'm going to do that a second year and then a third year, because lo and behold, now I can beat the standard deduction. Right. Is that factored in? Are you seeing that in the data anywhere, or is it still anecdotal based on what fundraisers are seeing in the field?
that was definitely something tax preparers and tax advisors were advising people to do, particularly affluent people with some flexibility over how to schedule their income or whether to put off giving in that way. That's definitely something people were advised to do. The data don't show, which are kind of gross in the data sense, they're gross, don't show the kind of fluctuations you'd expect to see if this was a widespread practice. To be sure, there were some other discontinuities in this period after the tax law passed, not least of which was COVID, which had also had an effect on filing patterns. There certainly is an advantage in bundling charitable contributions if you have the flexibility to do that, and thus take 2 or 3 years worth of giving. Don't hold off on doing that giving for 1 or 2 years, perhaps even notifying your church or synagogue or local charity, don't worry, I'm giving it to you in 2 years, and then claiming it all in the third year and then getting yourself above the standard deduction. That's an option, though, increasingly only in higher income ranges, because again, the standard deduction now with inflation for a married couple is now up to $30,000, just about $30,000. And there's increasingly fewer people for whom it doesn't make sense just to like take the standard deduction and be done with it. And it's harder and harder for many people in that sweet spot contingent between 100 and 200. Their giving is never going to amount to so much that it's worth their while to delay giving for that many years. It's really something that you have an incentive to do only if you have very high income. Now, what we saw in our data, for instance, was that people making over $1 million or more, between comparing the pre-tax law change to post-tax law change, they significantly increased their giving. There was a reduction in itemizers, even in people among millionaire earners, not as severe, though, in lower income brackets. Their giving went up quite a bit, in line with their income. Their income spiked due to a big surge in capital gains in 2020 and 2021. Their giving also rose because they still have a significant incentive to make deductible charitable contributions, and they did. But the claims in the lower income brackets, up to in the lower hundreds, went down quite a bit. And it doesn't mean total giving went down. I should emphasize, people who make, your median income Long Island family making $150,000 a year, that couple didn't stop putting money in the collection basket or giving to the Boy Scouts or the local United Way. But what they did do was they had a less of an incentive to do it, and they had less of an incentive, especially at the end of the year, to even think about making sure they had given to the max, because there simply was no point in it from the point of view of the tax advantage for them. The tax advantage for them had vanished.
And this paper does not claim that folks not meeting the standard deduction are not giving charitably, as EJ just said. Howard, did you want to amplify that point?
Well, one of the things that motivated us to do this study originally, Bill, was the hypothesis, I guess you'd call it, and I know Congressman Ryan thought this was going to happen, and he helped to craft the 2017 tax law, was that in states where the state and local tax bill is very high, New York and California are the prime examples, and they're also the biggest philanthropy states in the country. The thought was, because the state and local tax deduction was capped at $10,000, and the average state and local tax bill was far higher than that in New York and California, that you would have taxpayers who would say, oh, I know how I can keep my taxes low. I'll avail myself of the charitable deduction. And I can deduct now up to 60% of my income for charity. But we found that that hypothesis was not borne out, that they did not avail themselves of that. And it was a nice idea, but it didn't happen.
Howard, using this information and looking forward, the tax policy expires in 2025, when we will, one way or another, have a new president. We'll have a new Congress. They'll be taking a look at this, unless somehow the policy is, reaffirmed before 2024 comes to an end. But you talk about the universal charitable tax deduction. This was something in place until the 1986 federal tax policy. Then it went away. We had it briefly during the COVID years. Can you help our audience understand how that universal charitable tax deduction, and our fundraisers, remember, they were receiving these $300, $600 checks, sometimes for people who had never donated before. How does that fit into the findings of the paper, and how you hope people use this information moving forward when the policy is revisited here either in 24 or in 2025?
Well, you're right, Bill. The CARES Act, which was the congressional response to the COVID crisis, made it possible for those who do not itemize or did not itemize their tax returns to get a charitable tax deduction, because they were able to report that above the line, is the phrase. And I'm sure all your fundraising professionals know that phrase very well. And a $300, or for a family, I believe it was $600, above the line deduction makes the deduction for charitable giving universally available for anybody who is filing a tax return. And that would be a way of increasing the reach of the charitable deduction and moving away from it being reserved for the upper income brackets. And so the possibility that that will be in play should not be viewed as a wild idea, because it was in the CARES Act. And that was a bipartisan act. And so merely revisiting that particular aspect of the CARES Act, which was there for 2 years, merely revisiting that could expand the reach of a tax incentive. And incentive is the important word. We don't know whether it'll incentivize. It does incentivize. Whether they'll give or not, we don't know. But it would increase the reach of a tax incentive for those upper middle classes.
The proponents of the universal charitable tax deduction will say that that would make tax policy towards charitable giving more democratized, more equitable, more inclusive. And again, at the fundraising school, we don't take positions on public policy. What we hope is that research such as this, and produced by our school, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and other trusted resources, can just inform you when you go to that town hall meeting, when you vote, when you communicate with your elected officials, that you can do so from a data-driven standpoint. I want to ask both of you to conclude. I'll start with EJ and then Howard. Your advice for fundraisers. Again, we know that there are a multitude of reasons why people donate. It could be their religious faith. It could be they're an alumni of that program or know somebody who was. It could be tax incentives. It could be all sorts of many different reasons tied into their morals and their ethical lens and so on and so forth. And yet there's also this issue with tax policy. EJ, how do you hope fundraisers can utilize this study as they're doing their fundraising today and fundraising planning for the future?
Well, I think that there's two ways I hope the study will serve this purpose. One is just as a reminder of something that I know is second nature to fundraisers, but can't be stressed often enough, which is that taxes matter and tax incentives matter. To the extent that there are people who are more or less on the bubble when it comes to the size of the standard deduction and the size of their itemized deductions as reduced by the state and local tax cap, it is worth talking about bundling to those who have enough discretionary income to do it from year to year. However, then again, we've got this issue next year of the whole tax code, of the whole 2017 tax law expiring. I think as a matter of public policy and as a public policy agenda, there's a very, very strong a very strong incentive and a strong argument to be made on a bipartisan basis for restoring the universal charitable deduction. As I said, and as Howard and I have reported here, clearly very high income filers continued to make deductible charitable contributions and to increase them as their income increased. We want, as a public policy priority, it's really difficult to argue with creating this incentive and restoring this full incentive for people in every income bracket. I think the experience with the CARES Act showed that. And among all of the other fiscal priorities Congress is going to have, no matter who controls Congress and the White House after this year, as they go into next year into rewriting the tax law, clearly this is something that should be a public policy priority. Is something that has a broader positive impact and deserves support. And I think can be brought up by fundraisers when they talk to some of the donors they're hoping to raise money from.
And this is just one way tax policy affects charitable giving. Of course, there's capital gains taxes
Right.
when donors sell stock or other items of value that are subject to capital gains tax. Estate planning, different types of vehicles that can be set up are tax advantaged as well. Howard, how about for you? What should an everyday fundraiser do with this study?
Well, I happen to be a big fan of donor advised funds. And I think that fundraising professionals may want to work with clients to help them, encourage them to set up donor advised funds. And I'll try to link that back to tax policy. Donor advised funds give you a way to bundle. You can make large donations to donor advised funds and get the tax deduction immediately in that calendar year, but then parcel out your donations over time if that's what you want to do. So that way is a way of formalizing the strategy that EJ was talking about with bundling. But at the same time, when those funds are invested through the donor advised fund, whether it's with a community foundation or with Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab, those funds are increasing in value, assuming the market does well, which it's been doing very well. Didn't do so well on Monday, but those things happen. But so I think donor advised funds become a good vehicle for taking maximum tax advantage, but also having your funds grow over time and being parceled out to the charities that you care most about.
And we remind our audience to look at the archives of this podcast. We've, on more than one occasion, had a chance to talk with Dr. Dan Heist and Dr. Danielle Vance McMullen, who lead the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative. They have documented the significantly large growth in the use of donor advised funds for individual donors. Howard Husock of the American Enterprise Institute, E.J. McMahon of the Empire Center of Public Policy. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
And we want fundraisers to have this level of understanding on all the motivations that affect charitable giving, including tax policy. This, of course, is the U.S. context. We know some of our viewers and listeners are paying attention in their respective nations around the world. And we cover these subjects in our 24 public courses, leading to 4 certificates. And we also can customize training just for your nonprofit, your region, your association in the United States, anywhere around the world. We can teach in person. We can teach online. We also have quarterly webinars, these weekly podcasts, and all of our knowledge gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in its 5th edition. This information is available on our website at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. Our producers today are Mike Anthony and Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.